Shalom, shalom. I'm so excited about today's topic because today I want us to talk about the difference between submitting to the will of God and submitting to the way of God. Yes, you might thinking like are not those the same thing? Yeah, I totally get that. Yeah, because it's a good question, right? But let me tell you, there is a difference. There is a difference, and understanding that difference is going to deepen your relationship with God because in ways that you didn't even realize were possible. So, so all right, let's start with the basic, right? Submitting to the will of God is all about surrendering your life to Him. It's when you say, God, I give you control over my life. Not my will, but yours be done. So, so now that's a huge, that's a really huge step of faith, right? Because most of the time we feel like we are losing control if we submit to God, but it's um it's a very beautiful moment because it's a moment we kind of realize that and we recognize that God's plans for our life is better than anything we could ever come up with. And um and I don't know about you, but that's really powerful. That's really, really powerful because when even when we go to Romans 2, the first verse says, present your body as a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is reasonable service. So so that's what it looks like to submit your will to God. You just lay it down at His feet, totally, completely. Your dreams, your plans, your desires. You give Him everything. And but there's the thing. Here's the thing. Our On our own journey with God, I found on my own journey with God, I found out that submitting your will to God is just the beginning. Yes, because there is a deeper, let me precise, say it again, deeper next step, which is submitting to the way of God. And that's what we're going to talk about next. Okay, so now let's talk about submitting to the way of God. This is where the rubber meets the road, right? Because you see, submitting to God's will is saying, yes, Lord, I trust you. I trust you with my life. I trust you with everything in my life, my job, my desire, my plan, anything. I just give it to you. But submitting to His way is saying, yes, Lord, I trust you with the process. Yes, even when it doesn't look like um, the way I thought it would look like, I still submit to your way. I still submit to your process, right? So let's get real for a minute. Because have you let me take an example. Have you ever prayed for healing, for example, and God responded you with something like, "Oh, you are going to be healed," and then nothing, right? God don't tell you how you're gonna be healed. I mean, He didn't tell you you're gonna take a pill. He doesn't tell you if it's gonna be by a miracle. He don't say anything, right? I mean, isn't that how God works sometimes? I mean, most of the times, because most of the time God's gonna give you the promise, but doesn't always show you the process. Yeah, think about it. Let When you think about Mary, for example, in the Bible, right? God told her that she's gonna be the mother of an eternal king, but God didn't tell her that she's gonna look at her son die on a cross in order for him to become that king, right? And so how about we have a lot of story like that in the Bible. We have the story of David, we have Joseph, right? God reveals the promise to Joseph, but he didn't say nothing about the process to get to that promise, right? And so let me just emphasize something again about submitting your will and submitting to the way of God, because submitting the will, as we submitting your will finally is like it's about surrendering the destination, but submitting the way is about surrendering the journey. Because if you submit the destination and not the journey, you might try to help God to make the promise come to pass along the way. And like Abraham, you might end up with an Ishmael. Yeah, because let's be real. Submitting to the way is where it gets hard. Submitting to the way, because we all want the promise of God for our life. We all want it. But sometimes we don't like the path He uses to get us there. We want the breakthrough, but we don't want the waiting season. We want the promise, the promised land, but we don't want the wilderness like the Israelite. We want the victory, but we don't want the battle. And yet, Proverbs 14, verse 12 says, remind us that there is a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death. So that's why trusting God's way is so important. His way may not always make sense to us, but it's always the best path for our good and for His glory. And so let's have take some illustration because I think the best way to understand the difference between submitting to the will of God and submitting to the way of God is by going through stories of the Bible. The Bible is full of examples of people who trusted God's will. Yeah, they trusted Him all the way long. And after they accept the will of God, they went through some very unexpected and challenging ways, yeah, to get to that promise. And we can see this in the story of Mary, in the story of David, Joseph, Abraham. So let's start with Mary. Mary, the mother of Jesus. Imagine this: an angel shows up and tell her that she's going to give birth to the Messiah. She's going to be the mother of an eternal king. Can you imagine her joy? Can you imagine? I don't know, if it was me, I would be like really overwhelmed with joy. But Mary in her humility, she says in Luke, when you go to Luke 1, the verse 38, Mary answered the angel and she said, I am the Lord's servant. May your words to me be fulfilled. So now that is what we call submitting to God's will. That's what it looks like. May it happen to me according to your word, God. But here's the thing: God didn't hand her a roadmap. She didn't know that being the mother of the eternal king would include giving birth in a stable. She didn't understood that it also means that she would be standing at the foot of the cross watching her son die. That's painful. That was heavy for a mother. That's really heavy. But through it all, Mary trusted God's way. And because of her faith, she became she became part of his plan, of his divine plan to bring salvation to the world. And that's really incredible, right? And so she didn't just submit. Mary didn't just submit to the will of God. She trusted his way too. She trusted the process, even when it was hard. And we have another example in the Bible, like I said. Now let's talk about David. David, let's picture this. David is a young shepherd. He's a young boy, yes, that gets anointed by Samuel to be the next king of Israel. Can you imagine the excitement? David David was probably thinking, "Oh my God, I'm about to be the king. Let's go." But here what David didn't know. God's ways to the throne wasn't going to happen overnight. No. Oh no. David spent the next 13 years running for his life, hiding in caves, and being chased by the king's soul. Talk about a plot twist. That's one. And he was already anointed as a king. And I'm sure that there were moments when David was like, God, is this really your plan? This doesn't feel like the path to the palace. It doesn't feel like. But David trusted God's way. He he even wrote in Psalm 37, verse 5, commit your way to the Lord. Trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. And God did it. God bring the promise he gave to David. He bring it to pass. And David became king. And David was one of the greatest king in history. But first, he had to go through the process. He had to go to submit to God's way. We have another example in the Bible, the Israelite, the bride of Christ. We are the bride of Christ. So um, the plan for God for the Israelite was really crystal clear. There was no confusion. He wanted to take them to the land flowing with milk and honey, right? That sounds amazing. Freedom after 400 years of slavery. That was the plan. That was the promise of God for the Israelite when they were leaving Egypt. But here's the kicker. God's way was not a direct road. No. Instead, they ended up standing in front of the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army chasing after them. And I mean, can you imagine that? Can you imagine the panic, the fear, right? But God, we all know the story. God made a way. God split the sea, and they walked through um, on dry ground. That's what we see. We read in Exodus in the chapter 14. And but that was not the end. That was not the end, because after the Red Sea, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And even when they got to the promised land, they had to fight for it. God's way required them to trust Him every step of the journey. And it wasn't just about reaching the destination, because it was also about learning to depend on Him. So sometimes in the process, God gonna teach you how to depend on Him totally, submission, right? And we have, how about Abraham, our father in faith? Because God gave Abraham an amazing promise. In Genesis 12, the verse 2 to 3, God said to Abraham, I will make you into a great nation, and all people on earth will be blessed through you. Now, that was God's will for Abraham. That was his will, his perfect will, to make him the father of many nations, right? But how about the process? Oh, because the way was not easy for Abraham. Abraham was 75 years old when he got the promise, and his wife, Sarah, couldn't even have children. She was barren. And then came the waiting, because they have to wait for 25 years. 25 years of waiting for Isaac to be born. Can you imagine how long that must have felt? And along the way, Abram and Sarah tried to take matters into their own hands. Yes, that's what happens sometimes when the waiting felt so long. But even in their mistakes, God remained faithful. And then, just when Abram thought, oh, the hard part was over, God asked him to sacrifice Isaac, the very son of the promise. And we all know that Abram trusted God's way. So even when it didn't make sense, Abram obeyed God. He followed God's instruction. That's what we are invited to do in our waiting season. And what did God do? God, He provided a ram as a substitute. We read it in Genesis chapter 22, verse 13. So Abraham's faith wasn't just about believing in God's will. It was also about trusting his way, no matter how difficult or confusing. And to Abraham lineage came Jesus and the Savior of the world. And that's really powerful. That's really powerful. That's the power of submitting to the way of God. Let's talk about Joseph, Joseph the dreamer, because Joseph is another great example to understand this topic. So at 70 years old, right, God gave him a dreams that he's one day is going to rule, and then even his family will love, we bow to him, right? All his family, his brothers, his fathers, everyone going to bow to him. So now imagine being a teenager and having a dream like that, right? Joseph was probably thinking like, this is it. This is it. God's wills for my life is to be a ruler, is to be a leader, is to be, you know, that's like being close to a king position, right? But what Joseph didn't know was how much the process to get there will cost him, right? His brother, because his brother betrayed him, he was sold into slavery, and he ended up in prison for a crime that he didn't commit. I mean, talk about a tough road. That's the story of Joseph. And do you do you think Joseph ever sat there and, I don't know, sat in prison and thought, God, how is this your plan? This doesn't make sense at all. Yes, I imagine maybe Joseph asked himself that question. But through it all, Joseph trusted God. He did, even when he didn't understand. And what happened is that God's way refined Joseph. God's way prepared him for leadership. Yes, God's way mold his character. God's way position him to save not only his own family, but an entire nation during a season of famine. And when we read in Genesis 50, verse 20, Joseph says to his brothers, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now be done, the saving of many lives. So, family, that's what happened when we trust God's way. That's what happened when we submit to His process. It may not make sense in the moment, but God is always working behind the scenes for our good. And so, each of these stories that we went over, show us that God's wills and God's ways go hand to hand. Yeah, they goes together. And his will is the destination, but his way is the journey. And while the journey might be long, might be difficult, or even sometimes, I don't know, painful, confusing, it's always worth it. Always. Because God's ways shapes us. God's ways grows us. God's ways prepare us. it molds our character for the promise, right? And so I don't know, maybe you are listening to me today and you are in a season where you are struggling with God's way, right? So let me encourage you, because God is faithful. He is, just like he he was with Mary, with Joseph, with David, with Abraham, with the Israelite. His way may not look like what you expected, but he's working it all for your good and for his glory. And so how do we apply that, that deep understanding into our life, into our everyday lives? First, I want you today to ask yourself, um have I truly submitted my will to God? Yes. Are you living according to your own plans, or do you live according to the plans of God for your life? So if you have not done that yet, because that's the first step, it's time. I think this is like an opportunity for you to surrender, to give your life to God, to give full control to God into your life. And so, and if you are already done that first step, then the next question I want you to ask yourself is, am I trusting his way? Yes, because maybe you are in this season right now where you are waiting on a promise that God gave you. Or maybe God is leading you down a path that feels unfamiliar, that feels uncomfortable, that feels even scary, right? But let me encourage you with Proverbs 3, verse 5 to 6, that says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, submit to Him, and He will make your path straight." This means you don't have to have it all figured out. God have it all figured out. You just have to trust him and take it one step at a time. Obedience to God's ways is a daily decision. It's a daily, I'm telling you. And guess what? His grace is there to help you every single step on the way. So take a moment today and pray this simple prayer, right? Say, "Lord, help me to trust your way, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't make sense. I choose to follow you. No matter what, I choose to follow you." And so if you have done that prayer, now just watch, just watch and see what he will do in your life, because he will never lead you astray. Never. So we are at the end of our video, and I love you very much, family, and I'm praying for you. And before we wrap up and close this video, I would just want you to remember that God's ways is always the best way. So on this note, take care, and let's keep trusting Him together. Have a good day. God bless you. Bye.